When we came to the United States, I started seeing that, oh, there's this whole thing called surf music. It's rolling? Okay. Oh, okay. So I was 14 when we moved to the United States, and I grew up in Zagreb, the capital of Croatia now. And it was a pretty large city, certainly by Yugoslav standards. It was the second largest city. So I grew up a city kid. And the 1970s were a pretty prosperous time for Yugoslavia, not because socialism was succeeding, but because Marshal Tito, the communist dictator of Yugoslavia, was very good at getting the West to lend money to Yugoslavia and to him. So we were awash with Western money, and it was great. We had a ton of tourists coming from West Germany, Italy, even the United States, and they were bringing a lot of dollars and Deutschmarks and all of that hard currency. And it was a lot of fun to be growing up in Croatia, Yugoslavia in the 1970s. Unfortunately for Yugoslavia, Tito died in 1980. And as soon as Tito died, it was like somebody shut off the lights. All these Western institutions, rather than lending money to Yugoslavia, started asking for their money back, and immediately shortages started. The key characteristic of socialism is government ownership and control over the means of production. That's how Marx defined it. That's how all socialists need to define it. And that means that the government runs the entire economy. And that's what happened in Yugoslavia too. And even as it passed various kinds of reforms, the government was still in charge of all the enterprises in the Yugoslav economy. And it failed for the same reason that socialism fails in every other place, which is that it is not compatible with human nature. And so you had terrible incentives where people were not incentivized to, in fact, create more, to do more. But more importantly, there was no pricing system, there was no private property in the means of production. And so the socialists knew they had no idea what to actually do with those means of production. Whatever they used it for ended up being an arbitrary decision, and they kept getting it wrong. They kept using all of these means of production in not just inefficient, but wasteful ways. And that's how we ended up with collapse. And I ended up being sent off to wait in lines for various items. Coffee, detergent, milk, those are a few of the items that I remember having to stand in line for. I was 11, 12 at that point, and a good candidate to stand there for hours. I hate lines to this day. I just can't take them. But nevertheless, the nice thing was still that Yugoslavia was open to the Western world. So we got a lot of Western movies, we got Western music. The communist record label would actually carry American records, British records. I was able to buy all of those things. They would sell out very quickly, but they were available. And all of my friends, we loved Western culture. We were completely obsessed with rock music. We were completely obsessed with every American movies, with every aspect of the American and Western culture, and did not give a damn about communism and what was happening in Yugoslavia. That's just how it was. My parents had a desire to move to the United States for a long time, especially my dad. That was a dream from childhood. He tried for many years, and it was kind of by a fluke that he learned of the writing of Russell Kirk, the great conservative, and he found out that there was a conference where Russell would give the main talk for the conference, and it was at Grove City College. And my dad contacted the organizers, and they offered to bring him to the conference, and he met Russell there. And at the end of that week, he was so impressed by my dad that he invited him to come study with him. At that time, Russell was actually a visiting professor at Hillsdale College. And my dad would actually drive him here quite often. So Mikasta is only about 2 hours away, 2.5 hours away. So I started hearing about Hillsdale College as soon as we moved to the United States, which was just over 40 years ago. So I was brought up to love the US and love the Western culture by my dad from the very beginning. He definitely instilled that in me, to hate communism and love freedom. So he really tried to instill in me this kind of an attitude of love of the individualism that is at the core of the Western society. And I think that was really what I observed in rock and roll music. It was about individualism. It was the expression, you had these amazing musicians that are, of course, completely iconic today, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, right, AC/DC, that all had a highly individualistic sound and basically followed their own path. There was a brief period of time in the early 60s between all the early rock and roll pioneers, Elvis and all those guys, and the Beatles, where instrumental rock music started becoming a big deal. And it became a big deal in quite a bit of the world. So you have people like Duane Eddy, The Ventures, Dick Dale. But in Britain, there was this band by the name of The Shadows, and The Shadows were the biggest band in Britain before the Beatles. They were huge. They had a ton of #1 hits. That was the music of my childhood. I continued to hear The Shadows as I was growing up, and I fell in love with that sound. And so the first thing that I wanted when we came to the United States was a guitar. So I made a deal. I would sell off all of my belongings from Yugoslavia, and that's fine. I'm excited to come to the US, but I want an electric guitar. And so my parents actually lived up to that deal and bought me an electric guitar for my 15th birthday, and I've never been without a guitar since. So I started learning how to play guitar, and it was mostly rock music. And in 1994, I became friends with this established economist by the name of Larry White. And he said, and we started, I don't know how we got to that, but he said that he loved surf music. And I thought, oh, this is incredible, because I was, constantly hearing little bits and pieces about surf music here. And here's an economist that loves surf music. And he said, are you aware that there is, in fact, a revival going on? And I said, no, I had no idea. So he wrote a bunch of bands for me. I wrote down a list of a whole bunch of surf bands for me. And I started getting those CDs, and I never looked back. And by 1996, I had a surf band. And I've had a surf band ever since. So it's been 28 years now. And it's a very much an underground genre. It's not something that most people have heard about. But most people would recognize what it is if they hear it. And it's just these kind of twangy guitar sounds. There's no vocals. It's just guitar playing the melodies. That sort of a thing. And, most people know like Wipeout. Right? They know something like that. Or maybe they know, if they've seen Pulp Fiction, they'll know the opening track, which is by Dick Dale, which is... Anyway, so all of that stuff is part of the kind of mainstream culture, but it's always on the edges of the mainstream culture. I ended up getting seriously involved in all of this stuff. So back in '96, and I've had 3 bands that have allowed me to actually play all around the world. So I've toured in Italy, France, Germany, Switzerland, Holland, Spain, Canada, all around the United States. And my bands, I think, have been able to contribute some good music to this. I've recorded 7 studio albums through the decades with the Space Gossics, my first band, and then the Madeira, and then most recently, Lords of Atlantis. It goes on like that. But those are the kinds of things that I loved about surf music, is that it wasn't the same old. It allowed for a great deal of incorporation of other influences. And that's the true surf music. It's not supposed to be a delicate sort of a flower. It's not intended for the faint of heart. It is rock and roll.